Hi, standoff. And we keep going. And now we are going to listen to a presentation on ransomware from Oleg Skulkin. Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. Good day, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Great that you picked my presentation. I know that right now, standoff has a lot of very interesting presentations going on, so I have to compete with my colleagues. So, the topic of my today's presentation is something that you have obviously heard of. There is a huge number of this kind of attacks. And today we're going to talk about ransomware attacks. And we're going to have a look at major tactics, means and procedures, tactics, techniques, and procedures that we encountered when responding to incidents, as well as in the course of our cyber intelligence activity. So, let me start by introducing myself. You already know that I'm Oleg, almost 10 years in digital forensics and incident response. And last 3 years, I've been intimately involved in issues related to cyber threat intelligence and threat hunting. And threat hunting, just like ransomware, is something that you obviously have heard of. Speaking of DFIR and CTI, I'm your typical nerd. I spend all my spare time researching, getting to know various reports written by my colleagues from other companies, and everything related to cyber threats, forensics and intelligence, all that. I also co-authored a few books on cyber forensics. If you Google me in English, you'll most surely find it. And I also publish a lot of posts and blog posts and articles on various topics. Just like my colleagues out there, I'm very respectful of all kinds of certificates. I have a huge list of certificates, and I only mention two of them that I'm very proud of, JCFA and GCTI. Okay, now on to more interesting things rather than myself. So, why ransomware? Why I'm here today to talk to you about ransomware? Well, first off, this is the hottest topic of the year 2020. Multiple ransomware attacks, a lot of operators, a lot of newest ransomwares. Ransoms really top high. Actors attacking Canon and Garmin. Ransoms amounted not just hundreds of $1,000s, but $1 million. Garmin had to pay $10 million to get their data decrypted. Most financially motivated threat actors that used to work with banks and attack banks are now into big game hunting. And in terms of techniques and tactics, you can see it as well, that they are into big game hunting. And back to tactics, techniques, and procedures, the TTPs, they're becoming more and more complicated, and it's pretty obvious because the threat actors try to attack bigger and bigger companies. And at least what we know from the news, they oftentimes succeed in that. So let us start with initial access. How do they get initial access? Well, in fact, there are all kinds of threat vectors, and the number of vectors keeps increasing and increasing day on day. The threat actors find most creative ways to initiate the access to the network they are aimed at. If you follow the news, you probably have heard the instance when the threat agent tried to buy out a person from inside the company for him to install the malware on one of the computers in the network so that adversaries could gain access to this network. So there are multiple of techniques, a whole plethora of techniques used here. The most popular of them, and it has been exploited pretty well for a while, it's external remote services. A lot of people still work remotely, so RDP is still the most common way for threat actors. A lot of services are available through RDP. Even workstations can be accessed through internet via RDP. One of the incident responses where I participated, the initial vector was indeed this one. So this technique was used. So they used password guessing, and the user computer was the point of initial compromise. People are not thinking about security right now. People are thinking of how to work remotely. So system administrators, unfortunately, do it in such a way that is not secure at all. That's why we're seeing the rise in the number of incidents. In particular, that some cases are really funny. When responding to one incident, it was a major manufacturing site. The computer that did indeed manage all the SCADA sensors, all the the whole of the manufacturing site, it was the point of initial compromission. It was available from the outside, and obviously it had a weak password on the administrator account, and it was easily hacked and used. So subsequently, most of the computers, materials on most of the computers were encrypted. It could be used by Dharma, say a very well-known threat actor that attacks both in Russia and abroad. We've identified attackers from Iran who make use of this ransomware. Their TTNPs are pretty simple. They usually move around manually using RDP protocol. They would just manually copy file and execute it. At the same time, this same vector is used by serious guys like Maze, ArcEvil, and other ransomwares that you most probably have heard of, and we'll learn about them within the framework of incident response, or sometimes we'll learn about them from the news. Yet another vector that is pretty popular, a lot of hacks occurred exactly thanks to those vulnerabilities. I mean here multiple vulnerabilities in public-facing applications. Like Pulse Secure VPN has been exploited very heavily. Not right now, but a lot of serious attacks occurred because of multiple vulnerabilities that have not been patched right there. Apart from that, since operators of ransomware sometimes buy things of other adversaries, an adversary would get access to a particular application and compromise it. What happens next is this access is given to somebody else, it's sold to somebody else. The company would patch everything up till the moment of the attack, but since the attackers already have valid valid credentials, they would get into the network and float across the network and get to the ultimate goal they were aiming at. Next is obviously phishing. We still have issues related to phishing. We still have multiple phishing attack instances, and they're used both to deliver Trojans using EPT campaigns and also with financially motivated adversaries. Bank Trojans like Trigbot that has been active since the year 2018 and it has been used to get initial access to networks and with subsequent full compromise of network and then encryption with Duke ransomware. Then Qbot that is also used to gain initial access, but the operators use Prolock ransomware and many, many others. Well, multiple of those, and all of them use all of them act so as to become a door into a major corporate network. Most of these threats are relevant to USA and Europe, not Russia, but there are certain attackers who also concentrate on Russia and CIS countries. Some operators, well, at least they are deemed to be Russian-speaking actors. There are also some Russian-speaking groups that avoid attacking Russia and CIS, not to be easily detected, but some of them do act in Russia and CIS, like Old Kremlin. We've written a report on them. They make use of Trojans, self-written Trojans for initial access, and they also have self-written ransomware that they're using in order to fully encrypt a network. If it's not the main computer, it's not of interest to develop the attack. They would still go ahead and encrypt this computer. So we are catching up with global trends in this respect, and most probably we'll see attacks like that more and more often. And major organizations here in this country will experience those. Now let's have a look at an example, a very trivial example, Trigbot. Pretty old Trojan for bank instances, a lot of modules for different purposes. Delivery methods are multiple. It's either a phishing link in an email or an attachment, a booby trap, standard booby trap. So this is an example from one of the latest campaigns. It was an attachment, if I'm not mistaken. So it's an Office document, and there's a macros in it. So should the user clicks allowing macros execution, then a loader is copied to the disk, and then from a compromised website, the Trigbot payload would be downloaded, and on it goes. Trigbot even comes up with a manual telling them that this is what you need to do for us to demonstrate us this protected data, like invoice or something like that. Social engineering here. So the person would follow the instructions and finally gets infected with the Trojan, and the Trojan would get persistence. On to the topic of phishing, not just emails, not necessarily emails. There's a very interesting framework called SOC Gaulish. This is the framework used by Blessed Locker operators. The Blessed Locker ransomware used to attack Garmin. So the attackers would compromise a legitimate website usually visited by a particular organization. The person would enter this site and see something similar to what you're seeing right now. You are using an older version of your browser. Please update it. And people are scared by specialists in cybersecurity, right? They are told to update constantly, so they would just click on update Firefox or update Chrome, whatnot, and they would download an archive with HTML file or any other file. So they would launch this file, exe file or something, and the information would go to the servers controlled by the adversaries. And if this computer, if this particular person is of interest to the adversaries, if this is a major company, then the payload in the form of Cobblestrike is being launched. If the computer is not of interest, nothing happens. So this is another interesting technique being used by the attackers. Back to the MITRE attack. This is common execution techniques that are being used for execution at the target workstations. What we have here is something that you see in the slide. All the techniques are directly related to the initial access and the way the Trojans are delivered. They're used in, most of the Trojans are used in BGH, big game hunting operations, and it's very important to understand how they work and what is being used to detect it at the point of just being infected with Trojans. Because the attack usually lasts 2 or 3 weeks, so if you detect it in a timely fashion, then you'll have a chance of preventing the attackers from reaching their ultimate goal. So how would they, what is the persistence technique? Valid account is one persistent technique that I skipped. When you have a legitimate account in the system, they would get hold of an account, a legitimate account, and even if defenders would block some of the accounts, they probably failed to identify some of them, and the adversaries would have a second chance of accessing the compromised infrastructure. Not that they have very difficult persistence techniques. More often than not, they're not difficult at all. Registry run keys, startup folder for Trigbot, or a scheduled task. It's very popular, and it's being used by almost all the adversaries out there, be that APTs or financially motivated hackers. It's in among top 20 of MITRE attacks. But there are also SDB bots allegedly affiliated with KA505. So this bot make use of more interesting things, like application shimming, for example. That's why it's called SDB bot, because in the context of this technique, they make use of files with SDB extension and image file execution options injection, an interesting technique. Not very frequent technique, I have to admit. And if I remember correctly, it already can be it's already identifiable, but if autoruns is used, then it wouldn't find this type of persistence technique. So why SDB bot has to have 2 techniques? More often than not, they're used separately. If you have Windows 7, then it's application shimming that is used. If you have Windows 10, then they would go for image file execution options injection. So, a couple of words about image file execution injection. So the registry key, you can see on the slide, has the library name in it. It gets into C Windows System 32 with SDB-bot installer. And as soon as the user is in the system, what happens is the auto launch of our Trojan. Once again, if we are talking about threat hunting or detect, well, this is a way to go. You need to look at this registry key, especially modifications of this registry key, closely in your attention. Because there is SDB bot, but looks not just in run and exit tasks, but uses more exotic ways of gaining persistence in the system. Well, obviously, initial access is not where it ends, right? Next, you need to understand where these people and the extent to which the adversaries are interested in this particular company and how they're going to develop their attack. For that, you want to gain information about what kind of network it is. Most popular among the tools that is being used by all kinds of attackers that are using ransomware are AD find. If we're now creating a top list, estimates are Eagle, Doppelpaymer, Rook, almost all of them. All of the attacks related to this ransomware, everywhere you would find trace of adfind. I mean, not necessarily the file would be called this way, not necessarily it's called adfind. More often than not, it's a batch script. That contains strings like the ones you see on the slide here, and allows to gain information on the domains and the users and computers used. And next, study this information on their own servers for information discovery purposes. Yet another way for discovery, again, it's something that we oftentimes find in terms of traces, it's IP scanner. It's used by all kinds of groups, back to Tarma ransom actor, also Krylog and others that are using less complicated tactics and techniques. So they make use of IP scanners, but also less prepared operators make use of it as well. There's also soft perfect network scanner. We see traces of it being used pretty often. Oh, and by the way, it was very actively used by operators of Cobalt group that used to attack banks very actively, as well as operators of other ransomware attackers, because it's very useful and very convenient to use. That's why, most probably, that is why they chose it. Especially if you do not use boxed exploits framework like Metaxploit and others. Through vulnerabilities in publicly available applications or else, or some in a different way, they would get credentials and then they would use RDP protocols. They would see the screen. You see the screen of the compromised server or workstation, and then it has a GUI. So if we are talking about Trojan-based compromission, it's different there. But it happens in various ways. Sometimes they do have still use Pathfinder despite the fact that they have access to graphic user interfaces. There are multiple ransomwares, so a lot of adversaries switch from this from their usual attacks to this ransomware type of attacks. So as soon as you get information, you discover information on Active Directory, unless you still have the credential, but actually most probably they already got the credentials, but they still serve the network to get more credentials. This is Mimikatz. It's still extremely popular in Trojan, so that you don't download anything on the host. You would use invoke Mimikatz. I mean, time has passed, and it should have been detected reasonably well, but still attackers make active use of it. Oftentimes, we also see Lasan being used. It includes Mimikatz functions, but it also allows you to gain all kinds of authentication data. The data from, the password stored in browser. Any password stored anyway would be delivered to you by Lasan. So more often than not, it's used with all switch that allows to gain all the credentials, all the passwords stored out there. So everything is pretty straightforward, and yet, as you can see in the news, and as you can see on their websites where they actively publish their data, it's very popular. Even when using these pretty obvious techniques, they still manage to achieve a lot. I mentioned password guessing, brute force attacks, and this is one of the tools that you encounter reasonably often in the course of incident response. People would go with NL brute. They would copy it to compromised host that they got initial access to, and they would use it to see whether or not this credential could be used to log in somewhere else. So that way, you get to know how they did password guessing, how did they use brute force initially, and how come, and where else in the network they wanted to go, and where else they wanted to break into using password guessing. Well, there are multiple ways of brute force in practice, but this is what we saw in service. Just by way of illustration, I decided to show you this one. Lateral movement. As soon as they collect everything and scan everything, they do get a credential. You need to carry out lateral movement. Why would they want to do that? Most probably you've heard that a lot of ransomware operators also get data out of it. They spend time in the network, and they're capable of getting a lot of data. I mean, data collection to terabytes, huge volume of data.
So in order to get to the place where the most confidential and valuable data is stored, obviously you have to do a couple of lat moves before you fire up your ransomware. And naturally, RDP is the most convenient way of doing it. And many companies do that. That's why many groups have a bunch of scripts at their disposal, which enable them to modify the registry and modify the settings of the Windows firewall in order to connect remotely via RDP. Because because obviously such connections are often disabled. That's why perpetrators will often use scripts. One of them I'm actually referencing in the slide. This is the one that has been used by the operators of Prolog and some others I'm not going to name. Naturally, if they use post-exploitation frameworks, this enables them to move around the network in a very convenient manner. I think you must have recognized this particular example. It is Cobblestrike, obviously. And you might say Cobblestrike is a commercial product, and it's pretty difficult to get one's hands on it. You can't even buy it just like that. It's not really served at your nearby pharmacies. However, many crime groups are using it very much, particularly for blackmail and ransom. Actually, our analysis shows that over 70% of all ransomware attacks have leveraged Cobblestrike, at least to a certain extent, which means it's a very popular tool. That may be very surprising. Cobblestrike has been around for such a long time. It's very easy to trace, right? We will remember that some time ago, there were groups like the Cobbled Group, which were very active. And actually, Cobbled Group was named after this particular tool. And still, many banks have not learned the lesson. I mean, some banks have been attacked, and they learned the lesson the hard way. But all the others turn out to be defenseless, which is in a way surprising because some companies have got tools at their disposal which they hope will protect them, and still adversaries apply the well-known and not so well-known tools and hack them up. Say many companies will be running AVs on all the hosts detecting lots of bad things, but this doesn't mean that companies will actually follow up on these detections. So when we investigate such attacks employing ransomware, what we very often see is that, say, for 3 weeks or 4 weeks, the poor AV has been crying that everything is bad, the whole network has been compromised, but nobody paid attention. Which, in my opinion, shows that employees often don't have the competences, or maybe they are negligent, thereby enabling the adversaries to get their dirty hands on the system. Like I said, many attackers will exfiltrate the data. Very often, it's a walk in the park. Quite often they will use various cloud storage accounts. Mega.nz was extremely popular. Even the operators of the network ransomware would simply install an application on the compromised server and use it to upload the data to Mega. Others, including the operators of Mega and Egregor is extremely active now, they would use their own FTP server. Same goes for the operators of Prolog. They use their own FTP server, and they use their own proprietary tool called rCloud. Lots and lots of attackers have their own websites, and they keep them updated. And there, they will publish the data from the compromised companies. First, they publish an announcement. If nobody gets in touch with them within 3 days, they will publish the announcement saying, we've hacked this company, we've stolen a lot of data, and usually as proof, they publish like 1% of the data they defrauded. And if the company does not initiate contact with them in any particular way, all the data will eventually be made publicly available. You know, some operators such as are evil even run whole auctions trying to sell this data. Much really depends on the personal choices made by the attackers. But briefly put, all the big groups attacking large corporations, they all have their own websites where they publish such information. And they use it as another way of blackmailing the company into paying ransom. If you don't want to pay for decryption, at least pay us something for not making all your confidential data publicly available. Now let's discuss deployment of ransomware. How the ransomware travels around the network. Usually there will be lots of computers on the network, and you will want to have your ransomware deployed everywhere. Naturally, some operators, particularly those who enter the network via RDP, will use the same protocol to do their lat moves. However, this will get you only so far. For example, if you have 10,000 hosts, connecting to all of them via RDP and launching lockers there is not very convenient and can actually be easily detected. That's why very often they will use other tools and other methods to propagate across the network. Well, naturally, before they start propagating, they will have already switched off all the information security tools and wiped the backups, which means that nothing stands in the way of their network traversal, network propagation. Usually they do it on Friday night or Saturday night when you don't really expect many people to put up much of a defense. It's not that they use too many diverse tools. I mean, the particular scripts they will be using will be unique in most cases. But look at the slide. What I'm showing there is the script used by the operators of Networker. They've already installed, they already have the IP addresses of the hosts, they have the file with them. They also have the credentials for the domain administrator. So they will be mounting network disks. They will copy a network there. And as you can easily see here, it is contained in a PowerShell script. And then they use ps-exec executable to launch this script on all the hosts with the right arguments. Nothing special, right? ps-exec is actually an extremely popular tool. It gets used very often, even by people who are not highly qualified. I mean, they won't be using exactly these scripts I'm showing here, but very often they will have a list of IP addresses or a list of host names, and they will either launch it or they will try to. Doesn't mean they're always successful, because sometimes they fail to switch the AV off and the other tools as well. So much will depend on a particular company. Another example is Egregor. Like I said, Egregor is a ransomware which is rising in terms of popularity. They have been news earlier today about another victim in South America. See, they are using WMI, Windows Management Instrumentation. In particular, they're using WMIC. Just like in the previous example, we have a list here, a list of IP addresses of all the hosts. They also have the compromised password for the domain administrator. So they're mounting disks. They're copying the file itself, the file of the ransomware itself, which is a DLL file. And then they use WMIC to launch this DLL file with run-dll32. And they're also writing a log file in order to check which machines are now running the ransomware and which are not, in order to decide how they want to abuse the remaining hosts. Let me give you another example, which I also consider quite interesting. This is Rook ransomware. Rook has been in the wild since 2018, and as you can see from the text, it also leverages WMIC. It also contains a list of the particular hosts and their IP addresses. There may be some differences from case to case, but here we can see they're also using the password of a domain administrator, and they're also using background intelligence transfer service in order to copy the payload of Rook and have it launched. This time, it's a simple exe file. Actually, some operators don't need ransomware at all. Although there are so many ransomware software items around, and they're being advertised in so many websites. And if you want, you can actually get ransomware and do a production sharing agreement with them. That is, pay them a cut of what you're making. As long as you can motivate your client, quote unquote, to pay you the ransom. So there is this opportunity out there, but some people would simply use perfectly legit software, such as Descriptor, in place of ransomware. So they will encrypt your disk, they will hold the only passwords that can decrypt your disk, and then they will start blackmailing you, demanding a ransom for decryption. So they are not really installing any ransomware. They are using an open source encryption utility. Which puts the lid on my presentation. Thank you very much for your interest. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you may have learned something useful. Thank you very much. Take care. Well, thank you very much, Oleg. Thank you for your presentation. The only question I can see in the chat actually, it's so good, we'd rather take it outside the broadcast. How about you answer it in writing? It's about active prevention as part of a commercial utility. Have a great day. Take care. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. My pleasure. It was very interesting. Thank you.